in college admissions. And then we'll start with Professor Peter. Tell me if I'm pronouncing it right. Professor Arcidiacono from Duke University. Okay, go ahead, Peter.
Great. Thanks for having me. Along with Rick Kahlenberg, we were two of the expert witnesses in the students for fair admissions cases that we're talking about post that ruling. And if you had to ask me prior to the ruling, what I would have expected, I would have thought it would be perhaps good for the country, but maybe bad for me, because it might become even more uncomfortable to express alternative opinions on these kinds of issues. I've actually been very pleasantly surprised by a few aspects of what's happened post-ruling. And the first is exactly that I think students actually seem much more comfortable expressing a contrary viewpoint. I think the coverage of the case going into the Supreme Court decision was very much of the mindset that a ruling against racial preferences would be horrible. I feel like the coverage after was much better than that as a whole, and partly because the public's response to that ruling. And I think that's been great for the purposes of free inquiry and having sort of legitimate debates around these things. The second thing that I was very pleased with is my big fear with the ruling was what basically has already happened in the UC system, which is that they would get rid of test scores. That they would use that as a way to mask racial preferences. And what's been beautiful since then is that schools have really looked at their own data to see that the test scores matter. And in particular, they do what some of us have long been saying, particularly both of the other speakers on this. The test scores actually give the low-income kids a shot that they otherwise would not have had. And so I've been very happy with that. I'll get into this a little bit more, but it seems like the idea of colleges actually using their data to find out what works. If the ruling actually did that, to actually get them to use their data for good, that would be an amazing accomplishment. It also, and then the cynic in me is like, now these schools have come out and said these test scores matter. But there were a bunch of schools before then who've had a long history of these test optional policies that have said that that's not the case. But they've never shown the data to verify it. And that's been very frustrating. If you look at the polls, trust in higher education is very low. And I think that's in part because universities have not been trustworthy on things of this nature. So I'm hoping that we're going to see more and more of this revealing of the data. I feel like that the tide is slowly moving in this regard. Just last year there was actually, I'm hoping it's going to move us more towards a trend, more towards merit and such. Just last year there was an article published and included a bunch of prominent scientists across many fields, and it was titled "In Defense of Merit in Science." And the irony is that it came out in the Journal of Controversial Ideas. Come on, I think that should be in the Journal of Incontroversial Ideas. The idea that we've gotten to this point is pretty crazy. So, I'm somewhat more hopeful than I've been in a long time about, the direction things are going in higher education. The one, of course, very disappointing thing is that while they have looked at their test score data, they're now hiding their racial data. We were hoping, I think, at this point to be able to say, well, here's what the effect of the policy was. Here's how it changed the racial composition of these schools. And we can't say that because they haven't released the data. So rather than being able to talk about the actual effects of the policy, I would say just a little bit about what we can expect to see once they do have to release it. And that will happen in the summertime. I mean, there are obligations to report this stuff to the government, though maybe not as fine of a detail as we would like. The first thing is that absent collusion, you should see big differences across schools in the diversity share, because some schools are going to try to get around the ruling more than others, in part because of their expectations about what other schools are doing. And those things actually have a magnifying effect. So if I think that other schools are going to try to get around the ruling, and I'm worried about having a diverse class, so then I try to get around the ruling. But if those other schools were not getting around the ruling as much as I thought, my yield on those Black students is going to be much higher than I thought. And so you'll see these big changes in diversity across schools, which you generally don't see because there's effectively been implicit quotas for some time. What would be really great is to see how that worked with regard to early decision versus regular decision, because you could see, that maybe I thought I was not going to get a good yield on my minority applicants. I did. So then I get to regular decision, and that changes it. To the extent that we ever actually got to see the admissions data at that level for schools, I think that would be incredible. It will also be interesting, that said, universities do collude to some degree. I mean, that's one of the things that came out at the Harvard trial, is that they have these groups of universities that do talk behind the scenes. And so it'll be very interesting to see whether you see more stability at those top schools in terms of the variation relative to the other schools, which may not be able to collude in quite the same way. But this is all speculative because we just don't have the data. I think another thing to look for is to see, some schools were very prominent in how they were going to use essays to get around the rules. And you could sort of see, were those schools successful in that regard? Or were they just successful in inviting another lawsuit? But, to end on a more positive note, what my dream is that this will actually lead us to push for more accountability. Particularly, I think you can see that happening in some of the more red states that have said, look, we need to see what's going on here. And by doing that, we can actually see what works. So I'll end with just an example of how bad I believe universities are in using their data. And it comes from the fact that one of the things you learn when you go off to college is the importance of randomized controlled trials. That we do randomized controlled trials in order to learn about the world. This is how we figured out that the COVID vaccine worked. This is what Amazon is constantly doing. They have a whole a science page there showing you all the experiments that they're doing on you so that they can figure out how to best improve your experience, either that or make a lot of money. But what universities do is they do randomized controlled trials, but don't look at the data. And the way you can see that is most universities that are residential universities, they have randomized roommates. And that's a great idea to learn what works. But what you should do is then take that information and say, hey, we can figure out what pairs of roommates would actually work even better. And then if you actually did that, you could say, look, we figured out how to take those first generation students who want to be engineers, but are coming in behind on the math. And we compare them with people who that's going to be a positive experience for, increase their retention rates without hurting their roommate. If you actually looked at the data, you might be able to find things that work that way. So my hope is that the ruling will lead to an increase in innovation in higher education through data, and that would, in the end, potentially rebuild some of that lost trust. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And then our next speaker is Richard Kahlenberg. Okay, go ahead, Richard. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joseph, and thanks to the Heterodox Academy for having me. And it's great to be with my good friends, Peter and Rick. We've had lots of conversations about affirmative action over the years, and glad to be part of this discussion. So I've got some slides. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Okay. Let's see. All right, there we go. You all can see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, so I just, this is a sophisticated crowd, but just to review, this was a monumental decision in the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court struck down racial preferences at Harvard and University of North Carolina, 6-3 ruling in UNC, 6-2 in Harvard. Many of us had been through these affirmative action cases a number of times before the Supreme Court, and it always looked like affirmative action or racial preferences were going down, and they didn't. So this was decisive. And of course, the most famous quote from it is from Justice Roberts: "Eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it." So our focus today is on, what happens next, the post ruling. And the Biden administration had a summit right after the Supreme Court ruled. And there were a couple of people whose thoughts struck me as particularly interesting. One is Angel Perez, who's head of the National Association of College Admissions Counseling. And he said, "Don't let a crisis go to waste." And the president of Colorado College at the time, Song Richardson, said, "Affirmative action has made us complacent. Now that tool is gone, and I'm optimistic that all of us can work together to fix a broken system." Now, what is that broken system? So this is a study back in 2005. So it's old data. I'm going to give you some new data in a minute. And it said, looked at what counts in admissions when you run the data and find out when students who are equally qualified but differ in certain respects, what is the boost in admissions from different characteristics. And the biggest boost in Bowen's, this is William Bowen, former president of Princeton, and colleagues. What was the biggest boost? It was for recruited athletes. 30.2 percentage point boost in your admissions. So what that means is if you had a 50% chance of admissions on the merits, now you have an 80% chance. So just add 30 percentage points to your chances. Being an underrepresented minority, Black, Hispanic, or Native American, boosted your chances by 28 percentage points. Being a child of an alum increased your chances by 20 percentage points. Every college said for years that they gave big consideration to the fact that students had overcome odds, had been a first-generation college student, they're low income. And Bowen kind of exposed that wasn't true, that at the 13 elite colleges he studied, being first generation only boosted your odds modestly by 4 percentage points. And being in the bottom income quartile had no positive effect whatsoever. The more recent data come from the Harvard and University of North Carolina cases. And these are drawn from Peter Arcidiacono's analysis of what counted in admissions at Harvard for the classes of 2014 to 2019. And you can see that the biggest increase in your odds of admissions, as in Bowen's study, was for recruited athletes. Then for African Americans and legacies, if you were child of a faculty or staff, you got a substantial boost. Hispanics received a substantial boost. Applying early, which is something that wealthy students tend to do, gives you an advantage. And then, then as you move down the list, much less important was being economically disadvantaged or first generation. And as I don't have to remind this audience, there was actually a penalty associated with being Asian American. University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill has, their in-state admissions and their out-of-state admissions. The out-of-state admissions is much more competitive. And there you saw large preferences for Black students, legacies, Hispanics. And then lower on the list was first generation and some of these other measures. So as a result, in the past, under the pre-Supreme Court decision regime, you had a lot of colleges that were racially diverse but economically segregated. So Harvard had a majority of students who were students of color, something that I applaud. 22 times as many came from the top income quintile as the bottom income quintile, according to Raj Shetty's data. So not something I'm particularly happy about. And then Peter's research found that 71% of the underrepresented minority students admitted to Harvard were socioeconomically advantaged. And in fact, they came from the richest 1/5 of the Black, Hispanic, and Native American populations nationally. UNC, which you would think as a public institution might be a little different, they had 16 times as many rich students as low-income students. So moving forward, I think there are two paths for universities who care about racial diversity. The first is, Peter mentioned, is to use the personal essay loophole, which I think is quite risky legally if they push it too far. You can have consider an individual's discussion of race. And I personally have always supported the idea that if someone could document that, in fact, they had faced racial discrimination. This could be someone who's Asian, it could be someone who's Black, it could be someone who's Hispanic, it could, in rare circumstances, be someone who's white. That if that had an adverse impact on their academic experience and they could demonstrate that sure, that's something to consider. And the Supreme Court said that would be permissible. At the same time, they pulled back and said, don't simply engineer what you had been doing, re-engineer what you had been doing. And what I found fascinating is the dissent also didn't make much of this personal essay loophole, said it was lipstick on a pig. So it'll be interesting to see how universities respond, to what extent they try to use the personal essay loophole. Certainly we know from the changes in the essay that the personal essays they've been requesting, that they're interested in this. Whether they pursue it aggressively to the point of violating the law, we have to wait and see. Some are advocating that they violate the law. Richard Rothstein wrote in The Atlantic that institutions should simply defy the Supreme Court. What I support, alternatively, is using authentic race-neutral strategies. So socioeconomic preferences, giving a break to economically disadvantaged students of all races, better recruitment of students to make sure they are aware of the opportunities and are encouraged to apply. Percentage plans in some states where you are in the top of your high school class and receive favorable consideration. There are also millions of community college students throughout the country, some of whom are very, very talented. And so reaching out to that population is important as well. So what would happen if universities did shift and did some of these things? Well, this was a simulation that Peter and I worked on together. He ran the numbers. I made suggestions on how to go about providing a preference. And here we got rid of legacy preferences, got rid of the preferences for race, rid of the preferences for faculty children, and instead gave a socioeconomic boost to economically disadvantaged students of all races. And you can see white numbers under that simulation actually decline from 40% to 33%. Asian American admissions increase under the socioeconomic alternative. Black admissions dipped some from 14% to 10%. Hispanics saw their admissions increase. And the socioeconomically disadvantaged population, which in Harvard's world means about the bottom 2/3 of the American population, so not disadvantaged the way most of us would think of disadvantage, but Harvard students are so wealthy that you're disadvantaged if you're in the bottom 2/3. That population, disadvantaged population, rises. The test scores and the grades of those students were excellent, even though many of them had to overcome more disadvantages. One thing that the Harvard did not give us, and UNC did not give us, was access to data about wealth. That is your net worth, and the differences between Black and white students based on income or families is substantial. It's gargantuan when it comes to wealth, and so considering wealth might have had an impact on, or surely would have had an impact on, the racial diversity numbers. So last question I want to address is, will these race-neutral alternatives themselves be successfully attacked in the courts as a proxy? Something that I very much hope does not. I hope that strategy does not prevail. And many of you may know there was a case involving Thomas Jefferson High School. The Supreme Court declined to take that case, so Thomas Jefferson's plan of using socioeconomic preferences and a percentage plan prevailed. There were two dissenters, Thomas and Alito, but I think the dissent was so vigorous that it suggests that Alito and Thomas thought something significant was going on. That is to say, it wasn't just we were going to bypass this one case and then take the next one. That would be my reading of the tea leaves. If you look at what the Supreme Court justices said in students for fair admissions about race-neutral alternatives, things like socioeconomic preferences, clearly the liberals on the court are completely supportive of these efforts, want colleges to pursue them, but so did some of the conservatives. So Justice Gorsuch, pointing to the simulation that Peter and I did, said, Harvard could replicate its current racial composition, nearly replicate its current racial composition. And that language does not suggest he thinks there's something nefarious about using race-neutral alternatives. Justice Kavanaugh also said race-neutral strategies can be used to undo the effect of past discrimination and increase accessibility. So I've written some on this topic and have a new book coming out on it next year. So those are some resources for anyone who's interested in digging in further. So I will stop there.
Okay, thank you, Rick. And our final speaker is Rick Sander from UCLA.
Thank you, Joseph. Thanks for having me. I've long thought that Peter Arcidiacono and Rick Kahlenberg were the wisest people in this field, so I'm really glad that they're here. But following them means that that most of the points I can make have already been made. So I'm going to probably take less than my allotted time and just give some fairly disconnected, but I think relevant points on various issues. So one is that we should all keep in mind that that the term affirmative action is often treated as synonymous with racial preferences, but racial preferences are actually just one subset of affirmative action. And I think certainly what Rick said, and maybe what Peter said as well, is that in some ways the era of real affirmative action may just be beginning, in the sense that if schools are really constrained from using the sort of easy racial quota approach to getting diversity, then that may force them into doing things that are more creative. That's essentially what happened in California after Prop 209. And I'm going to briefly tell you that story. Prop 209 passed in 1996. And it was taken pretty seriously by the University of California. Consideration of race, I would not say disappeared completely, but it did sharply decline. And the university invested a lot in trying to develop race-neutral alternatives. They spent a couple $100 million building bridges between the various UC campuses and high schools in disadvantaged neighborhoods. They eventually developed something a little like the Texas 10% plan. They dramatically increased the familiarity of low-income California high school students with what are the steps needed to actually, get your high school record ready for UC consideration. And those things had dramatic and positive effects. They I think quintupled the number of applications from Black students from pre-209 through 10 or 12 years later. Tripled the number of Black applications and quintupled the number of Hispanic applications. And Black and Hispanic enrollment within 10 years of Prop 209 was significantly higher than it had been before Prop 209. And more importantly, completion rates were much higher. Graduation rates were higher. They were especially higher in the STEM field. All this happened, though, in an environment where UC was officially very anti-race neutrality. They continued to denounce Prop 209. They persuaded the regents to formally sort of say, we believe in being race conscious. That happened around 2003. And then around 2007, some of the components of UC started reintroducing race. That really biggest step happened on my campus, UCLA's undergraduate admissions, as has been documented by Tim Grosclose and other research, reintroduced race in 2007 and got away with it. They weren't sued. So by 2011, UC leadership had essentially pushed all the campuses to imitate what UCLA was doing. So by now, UC is, I think, only marginally restrained by Prop 209. I mean, they're restrained in what they can say, but I think their admissions policies are pretty much as race conscious as they are at other elite schools. So, so what does that tell us about what will happen nationally? Well, it might mean that there's sort of an initial intimidation factor, as there was with UC, or it might mean that schools are kind of go straight to home base and say, UC has been getting away with this for years, so we don't need to take this seriously. The realities are that any school that cheats has an almost infinitesimally small chance of being successfully sued. It's extremely difficult to bring these suits. It takes years and years and millions of dollars. There was an allusion, I think, in one of Rick's slides about SFFA is not chomping at the bit to initiate new suits against undergraduate colleges. So there's a whole issue of how this is going to be enforced. And as Peter pointed out, so far the schools are not being particularly transparent about what they're doing. They have seemed to be delaying as long as possible the disclosure of what the racial composition of their newly admitted classes are. As Peter pointed out, there is this very powerful group dynamic. Occurs in a couple of ways. One interesting way is in regards to mismatch. So mismatch is the idea that students admitted with a very large preference are academically disadvantaged. And as I mentioned, we saw that at UC, Black and Hispanic outcomes were much better when racial preferences were small. If say half the schools really tried to comply with the SFFA decisions, that would have system-wide effects in the sense that other schools would be admitting stronger students, even if they were using preferences. And the overall mismatch effect would kind of decline significantly across all schools. If schools panic and they think, well, if we're the only elite school that isn't using preferences, that isn't cheating, we're going to end up with no Black students. Then you'll have kind of a domino effect that will cause the use of preferences. So we're kind of witnessing a large game theory experiment right now. One of the things that might be a way of improving enforcement is if we can in fact get some red states to mandate transparency for state institutions. So I worked with the Martin Center in North Carolina to draft a model statute, which I think by now has been introduced at least in the North Carolina legislature. And that essentially said that public universities in a state that adopts this have to provide data about their admissions. And moreover, if they are going to use sort of criterion that have racially disparate effects, they need to articulate what their goals are in using those criterion, and then document, again through data, that they're actually achieving those goals. So if you had mechanisms like that, then that would, I think, really encourage the kind of experimentation that Peter was alluding to, and which I agree is highly desirable. It would encourage what Rick Kahlenberg is talking about, because schools would say, okay, so let's document what the most efficient ways are of using socioeconomic preferences that maximize student achievement, increase diversity, so on. So we've got to sort of figure out how can we create incentives for schools to do this. If say 5 or 6 states adopted this kind of transparency legislation, then it'd be harder for other schools to cheat, because you would then have data on what happens if you don't cheat. And you could leverage that data to challenge what other schools are doing. The last thing I'll mention is that several folks are using a database compiled by the Department of Education. It's a longitudinal database called High School Longitudinal Study 2009. And it tracks about 20,000 students who were 9th graders in 2009 and entered college in 2013. It's the most recent kind of comprehensive data we have on what are the patterns of moving from high school into college. And it's been used by some folks who have already written about what the effect of different types of socioeconomic preferences, for example, might be. The New York Times in March published an interactive tool where you could play with different criteria and see what the effects are. I'm working with a couple of folks, and Rick is informally advising us to try to show what that tells us about how college admissions have worked, and what would happen in fairly precise ways if schools in general went in different directions. One of the things we learned from that is that higher education, elite colleges in particular, have done a pretty good job of identifying high talent Black students. It's really kind of impressive and remarkable what a large proportion of Black students who have strong academic achievement end up being recruited by elite colleges. So if you have, strong scores and grades, you're much more likely to end up in an elite school than white or Hispanic students are if you're African American. And that's not a function of preferences. In other words, these are students who academically would do fine at the school that's admitting them. It's a function of sort of the outreach that's gone on, and maybe the generous type of financial aid offers that are made. What that means is that it is possible through outreach mechanisms to do a pretty good job of finding the diamonds in the rough and recruit them. So that means that we could do the same thing with low SES students and get much higher participation rates. So that's an important thing for educators to understand. Why don't I stop there? Thanks.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Professor Sanders. I posted a Zoom chat for people to share their public comments. And then I guess I can briefly start with my public comments. So I'm gonna share my screen on the Zoom chat. So Control S. Okay. Okay, so everyone can see the Google Doc, right?
Mhm.
Okay, great. So my comments are basically I'm speaking as a political theorist and also somebody who has informally mentored many students. And then, so my comment is that affirmative action, the role of race in college admissions, is part of a larger debate about democracy, about liberal democracy. And then we can think of like two models of democracy. One is the more traditional classical liberalism that sees a positive sum game between procedural and substantive liberties. So procedural liberties are the core process rights for individuals, such as free speech, fair elections, individual equality under the law. And then substantive liberties are other primary goals, such as social justice and equality. And I think for traditional classical liberals, including I think the speakers like Rick and Peter, they might consider themselves more classical liberals. They believe in individual equality, and they believe that that individual due process rights are valuable on their own. They contribute to other substantive liberties such as social justice. But there's another model, which is more zero sum. And so this is what people like Jonathan Haidt calls like the victim oppressor model. The victims are morally superior to and deserve special recognition and resources from oppressors. And so procedural liberties for oppressors, such as free speech and equality under the law, subtract from substantive liberties of victims. We have both progressive and conservative versions of this. So for progressives, it's like victims would be like BIPOC, people of color versus whites, LGBT versus Christians, migrants versus like border control, the native born. On the other hand, you have conservatives who flip this and see themselves as victims, and so you have a different views of victims and oppressors. And this is not just America, but it's worldwide. Here in South Korea, depending on your political viewpoint, if you're left, you see Koreans as historical victims against the Japanese. If you're more conservative, you think that Christians are victims against like communists. Okay. And so when we debate affirmative action, I think from a classical liberal perspective, racial diversity is an important substantive liberal end. We should openly and rationally debate whether race-based policies is the best means for that end and recognize the real benefits and costs of race-based policies. Okay, and then I have some examples here. On the other hand, from the model to victims perspective, that victims cannot really debate with oppressors. And the criticism of affirmative action is harmful to victims and either comes from ignorance or racism. Okay, now going to part 3. So this raises at least 4 questions. One is controlling for other factors. Are overrepresented groups such as Koreans, Chinese, Indians, are they still less likely to be accepted to selective colleges? Do admissions committees mostly prefer underrepresented groups? If so, do they use holistic admissions to enforce their preferences and beliefs? And 4, do students and scholars exercise academic freedom to question admissions officers? Would they be penalized, canceled for doing so? And then I have 2 propositions for the future. One is that if the admissions process is ambiguous and non-transparent, that admissions officers they're more likely to exercise their preferences, even if it's technically illegal. And so this is something that is already becoming kind of conventional wisdom. For example, Ivy-wise, they're telling their clients that, yes, schools are using supplemental essay prompts to help diversify their incoming class. My second proposition is that if the admissions process is ambiguous and non-transparent, that more parents, families will seek expensive experts to decipher the process. Expensive because formal admissions counselors are much more expensive than your everyday SAT tutor. And so, Crimson Education mentioned that, yes, please join Crimson Education. Our former admissions officer at Duke will be sharing her expert knowledge on what universities are looking for. Crimson Education is expensive. It runs from $10,000 to $60,000. Okay, so far data, we have sparse quantitative data about the composition of classes. We do have some qualitative anecdotal data from my family and friends, which suggests that racial and ethnic background remains a significant factor. So I can tell you about one student, 1550 SAT, 4.0 GPA, National Merit Finalist, Questbridge Finalist for modest income families, and Eagle Scout. But this person happens to be Asian American, and this person was rejected from Duke and Notre Dame, schools that seek diverse lived experiences. And so this year, Notre Dame accepted 96 Questbridge applicants. And so I was wondering, what do these Questbridge applicants have that were superior to this Asian American student? But they declined to share the data on the profiles of Questbridge finalists accepted. Okay. And so my final proposition is that the Supreme Court ruling unrealistically raised the aspirations of overrepresented groups and lowered that of underrepresented groups, that perhaps holistic admissions may be the new form of race-based affirmative action. Most students and scholars were not openly questioned or criticized holistic admissions, but some will. My advice to students is that if you support affirmative action and holistic admissions, you can speak openly and publicly. If you criticize, you may wish to speak carefully and sometimes anonymously. Okay. Whether you support or criticize affirmative action, holistic admissions, I encourage and support your freedom to speak, and will advise you on how to be the best speaker and citizen to be. Okay. Now, thank you. My final comment is that I think that holistic admissions and what's happening these days with all these quality students who are getting rejected, that it creates a lot of, so the more non-transparent the system is, it creates a lot of uncertainty and also paranoia. Okay. And so the students wondering my scores, by objective categories, it seems like I am much more qualified than all these people who are accepted. Okay. So why was I rejected? Was it because of race? Okay. And so it creates this kind of uncertainty and paranoia that, schools are kind of looking down on me because of my race. And so I think if the universities were more transparent, then I think you'll create more a sense of certainty. And then less need to hire this expensive, ex admissions counselors to tell you what's going on. Okay, so that's my public comments. Thank you. Okay, and so I'd like to open up to the audience. Okay, and I encourage the audience to go ahead and maybe turn your video on so we can have more interactive discussion. Okay, because again, transparency is a good thing. Okay, so please share your video, tell us what you look like. Okay, and then we'd like to hear from every member of the audience. Okay, so I thank you for a dedicated audience. Okay, so for example, maybe we can ask one by one, or we can popcorn each other. Okay, so Arthur, I see you turning on your video. Thank you. Do you have any questions or comments?
I just found this discussion very informative and enlightening. You guys know so much about this. It's great to be so that I could catch up about the current situation. I'm not in the U.S. These days, but I just have a comment about being in Asian Confucian societies. There's less social class differences in educational aspirations, and we see that for Asian Americans because most of their parents are from Asia. So I just want to broaden the issue. And Joseph, I really liked your broader discussion. If we give preferences based on socioeconomics, that may be a good thing, but absolute poverty and probably relative poverty is declining in China, and it's increasing in the US. The US has a poverty problem. And I think if the US could focus on this, and I'm so old, I can remember when liberals used to talk about a war on poverty, that if instead of trying to deal with the symptoms, I mean, I hate to sound like a root causes Democrat, but if you could reduce poverty and improve the lives of the working class, then we won't see such stark differences by socioeconomics that you all talked about. And it's kind of interesting in East Asian Confucian societies, the rich kids have kind of almost looked down on because they're the lazy, privileged guys that go on vacations and hang out with the girls and drive cars and enjoying life. It's the poor kid that's disciplined, works his butt off, sacrifices his current consumption, and kicks butt across the socioeconomic scale. And why does America still have this low income problem? I think if you take care of the income distribution problems, the socioeconomic differences hopefully wouldn't be as stark. But that's just a minor comment. I mean, I think there's some progress going on in the U.S., and I'm really delighted to hear this discussion by still worrying about the efficacy, the equity considerations of college. But again, Peter could correct me in this, there's not a lot of evidence that distribution of college really has reduced inequality in America. We have more and more people go to college, and the Gini coefficient keeps going up every year. I mean, what do you do to reduce the Gini coefficient in America? So I'll end there on, it's just, motivated by Joseph's broader discussion. Thank you.
Can I jump in on that? And then I know Peter's going to want
Sure, go ahead.
to jump in too. So I'll just say, I want to agree and disagree with you. I want to agree that, of course, we have to deal with the broader issues. When you're talking about 17-year-old, 18-year-olds who are applying to college, we have to address some of the inequalities much, much earlier. And I've spent a lot of my career working on K through 12 education, trying to improve opportunities for students. In the United States, if you're poor, oftentimes, coming from a poor family is one strike against you. But in the United States, you're very likely to go to school with other poor children, which is an independent second strike against you. And there are policy levers to try to reduce those concentrations of poverty in schools. So I've spent a lot of time working on that. I do a lot of work with community colleges. I've also worked with labor unions. So I agree with you that the bigger issue, college admissions, especially at these elite institutions, is a tiny slice of the problem. At the same time, I'll disagree or push back a little bit in the sense that the elite colleges will point to the fact that it's, there are these broader systemic issues that have to be addressed as an excuse to keep their classes economically advantaged. I mean, when Peter and I were testifying in federal court, we had the opportunity to hear Harvard's response to some of the, and that was essentially what they said. Well, life isn't fair, opportunity is not equal, and therefore there's only so much Harvard can do. And I don't want to let these institutions off the hook, because some very excellent institutions are much more socioeconomically diverse than others. So I want to, I'll just say, we can do both, and I hope we'll push forward on both fronts.
Okay, thank you, Rick. We have our first student who wants to share a comment. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Liberty. I'm from Kansas City, and I'm currently studying abroad in South Korea.
Great. What university?
Hanyang University.
That's great. Hanyang, and also U.S. University.
UMKC, University of Missouri, Kansas City.
Okay.
So right in the Midwest. My question kind of stems around the talk on data and statistics regarding students that of color who are wanting to get into schools. And it was the baseline is how do we make students of color not feel like a statistic? And I'm asking that question because in circles that I've been a part of, I think they would be surprised to find how much mathematical data is going into checking numbers and seeing how many Black students we have or how many students, Hispanic students that we have. And I've heard from frustrations of students of color is feeling like they are a statistic and like they're just there to fill a seat. And so I'm wondering if there are any conversations that are paired with, the conversation on affirmative action or holistic admissions that are centered around how to make students of color who are trying to get in these seats not feel like they were just a formula in a mathematical equation and picture. And I'm just curious on that topic because that's the main frustrations that I have heard from people of color in American universities. And I'm just wondering.
Okay, thank you. Great. Okay, thank you, Liberty. Okay, does anyone want to tackle that, or do you want to hear from some other audience members first before answering? Okay, I see
Peter, didn't you have a thought?
Yeah, I think that comment's great. And it's really interesting to think about the different approaches that different countries have had in this regard. So what's interesting is, in our economics faculty, we had 2 Black faculty, and they were both actually from France, which is sort of surprising. And what's weird about France is that you're actually not even allowed to record race there. Now that has positives for exactly the reasons that you're mentioning, that you don't feel like you're just a statistic. The downside to that is then if there is, discrimination and such, you can't even track it. And so trying to figure out that balance between not making race more salient than you really want it to be, and then at the same time dealing with the real issues associated with it's a fine line. And I don't have a great answer except to acknowledge it. I definitely see the tension there. So maybe it's actually a good thing that these schools are not talking about the racial distribution of their acceptances, because we're making it less salient. But I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
I'd say on that, Peter, I think this is temporary though. They're just holding off because they don't want to get sued. So they don't want to claim, they don't want people to claim they're manipulating their wait list. So they will come out with the data, of course. But we're in this short period where race is not the obsession at universities, but that will end.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I see hands from Sean and Alexander. Sean, can you go first with your question? Sean O'Dyer?
Yes, sure. Just a moment, I'll just take down my
Sure.
okay. Yeah, I sort of wanted to follow up with Art's comment and sort of take a sort of broader background view, or make a broader background kind of statement. And that's just to say that I guess the elephant in the room in these kinds of debates is the problem of prudential inflation, and how this makes these kinds of debates really, really more and more febrile. And I'm not quite sure how to solve this, or how this can be solved, but I wonder if some sort of structural transformations that are underway in the United States economy, for example, the sort of gradual reshoring of manufacturing jobs, or efforts to build up the United States manufacturing sector and build more housing, might address some of the underlying economic pressures, which have kind of driven, I think, a kind of meritocratic monism, or meritocratic value monism, which sort of more or less states that a university degree, and especially an elite university degree, is the ticket to the good life, and that the possession of such a degree confers a sort of special social value and even moral value on the person who attains it. So yeah, that's just my brief comment.
Okay, and Sean, can you introduce yourself, your affiliation?
Yeah, so come to speak my credentials. I work at Kyushu University in Japan.
Okay, great. One of our East Asia scholars. Okay, Alex, can you go ahead? Yes.
Let's make a quick comment. Yeah, grade inflation is a serious problem. It was the case that SAT was a little more predictive than high school GPA 20 years ago.
Sorry,
But-
can I just interrupt? I meant credential inflation, not grade inflation.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I'll finish my point just because I'm in the middle of it. It's the great inflation that occurred during the COVID epidemic kind of accentuated the disparity between the predictive power of SAT and GPA, and I think helped fuel the realization by universities that they had to go back to the SAT. In terms of credential inflation, it is true that over the last 40 years, the kind of pay gap between cognitively intensive jobs and non-intensive jobs has increased. So for, in the late 20th and early 21st century, you actually saw an increase in the premium for college graduates. That may be changing now and may change rapidly if AI ends up displacing knowledge workers a lot more than it displaces manual workers. So we're in a dynamic situation, but there is a reason why colleges were seen as an improved path to mobility for a while.
Okay, thank you, Rick. Okay, Professor Alexander Erler, you had a question or comment? Please introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Alex Erler from National Yangming Jiao Tong University in Taiwan. So I'd like to thank the speakers for their contributions. I have two questions, but perhaps for now I can just ask one. It would be for Professor Kahlenberg. Would you care to clarify the details of your proposal for socioeconomically based affirmative action, if that's the correct way to describe it? I mean, it certainly sounds appealing. I'm just wondering, alongside perhaps strengthened sources of financial support for students identified as economically disadvantaged, how do you see this kind of system? For example, would you support reduced expectations in terms of test scores for socioeconomically disadvantaged students, or would you rather support an equally meritocratic expectation on this front, and perhaps use the considerations about socioeconomic status as a tiebreaker to prioritize certain equally qualified students? Thanks.
That's a great question. I do support, giving a preference in admissions to students who've overcome obstacles under the theory that students who manage to do quite well, but not as well as someone who'd been given lots of advantages in their first decade and a half of life, may have more long-run potential than someone who's had everything provided for them. And so that in that sense, it's more meritocratic to consider the academic record a student has compiled in light of what they've faced. Now there are limits to this. So a student who faced incredible odds, was homeless and whose parents were abusive. I mean, you could just think of the litany of challenges that a student could face. If they were in some sense morally deserving because they managed to score 1,000 on the SAT, I would not favor admitting that student to a highly competitive institution because they're unlikely to succeed. So there are limits. And when I was presenting the data about the simulations that Peter and I did, we were cognizant of that there was a certain amount of give in the admissions criteria, a certain amount of wiggle room, if you will, where students would continue to be likely to succeed, and you could give some preference in admissions. The universities are giving large preferences for athletes and for Black and Hispanic students, for alumni children, for faculty children, and so they and these institutions have very, very high graduation rates. So it's not as if only the most qualified under a very narrow definition of merit that only considered grades and test scores those are the only students who will likely succeed. So that's I guess that's the sweet spot, is trying to make sure students are going to thrive and not be in over their heads. And Rick and Peter have done a lot of work on this issue of mismatch, where that kicks in. But I would give a preference in admissions to economically disadvantaged students. And if you don't, then the gains in socioeconomic and racial diversity will be tiny if you don't give that extra consideration.
I see, thanks. So from what I'm hearing, your understanding of meritocracy introduces a notion of, or centers also largely around the notion of moral achievement or merit, as opposed to purely academic achievement.
Right.
Is that a fair
I
point?
I think it's important to look at distance traveled as opposed to simply where someone ended up.
Right.
I see. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think Craig Urquhart, did you have something you wanted to say? Craig.
Oh, I was going to say, I'm looking at the experience of South Korean students in Canada, and my interest in the issue is following this from the political and social conflicts that are resulting from different stances. As you can imagine, the South Korean students are relatively hostile to the idea of arbitrary entrance standards. So it's generating social conflict, and I've just been tracking that. So that's why I'm here. It's a very interesting discussion.
Great, thank you, Craig. Craig, do you have any personal views or any personal reactions to what we learned today?
I'm a little wary of relying solely on the excellent fact-based arguments that are being leveled, largely because in the public sphere, the debate and discussion appears to be almost wholly emotional. And I mean, I don't want to use a crude terminology, but it seems to be entirely centered around tribal signaling. And I don't see that. I'm not sure how a facts-based discussion that doesn't access or deal with the emotional tenor of the debate is necessarily helpful long-term, outside of, say, simple court decisions and administrative penalties. I don't know how you win the debate unless you're willing to engage on an emotional basis. So what I'm not hearing is a really strong positive, well, partly, I'm not hearing a really strong positive message of addressing problems that goes through people's hindbrains. And I think, I personally think that's currently what's missing.
Okay,
thank you, Craig. Sure.
If I can just say one quick thing on that, because I think it's a good point. I remember being at a William T. Grant conference. They're a major funder of research, and there was a discussion on the merits about a particular issue, and then someone who came from Capitol Hill said that the way a member of Congress would greet those data is they would say, well, you can find data to say anything, This is a question of values. So I take your point that that simply talking about the empirical data isn't enough. But in terms of the socioeconomic approach, it does comport with the values of most Americans. By about 2 to 1, people oppose the use of race, sometimes even in higher numbers. By 2 to 1, they support the idea of giving a break to economically disadvantaged students who've overcome hurdles in life. And I think there is something emotional about, or values-based about, the appeal. But at the same time, I think it's, I guess what I feel like I can add to this discussion is, talking about the data that support or challenge people's assumptions.
The point I would add is that I think tribalism has been a major emerging problem in American politics for the last generation or so, and I think Heterodox Academy is partly a reaction to that and trying to create a counterforce. And I think that counterforce has a lot of emotional appeal. And I think we've seen in many realms some backing away from tribalism in the last couple of years. And I think the Supreme Court decision contributes to that.
So I was just going to say, I think that tribalism is in part a failure of universities to model how to disagree well. And, a buddy of mine teaches a class on polarization here at Duke, and the students are some of the happiest students I've seen in a class where they talk about affirmative action, they talk about trans and sports, they talk about abortion, all the stuff that you would immediately want to tense up, because how could you possibly talk about this on a college campus? But he's created an environment where we're going to lift people up in our discussions of these ideas rather than looking to shame or to tear down. But I think you've hit it right on the head that the tribalism that's universities ought to be leading the way on that, which requires modeling disagreeing well.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other questions or comments from the audience? Anybody from my students? Okay. While you're thinking about your questions or comments, I actually had a question for each of the speakers. Oh, yes, go ahead, Art. You had a question or comment? Art Sakamoto?
Yeah, this just a question for Kahlenberg. I mean, if you emphasized socioeconomics a little more, I mean, wouldn't that, I mean, I think it's good, but wouldn't that benefit Hispanics and Blacks particularly more, since they're more likely to be socioeconomic? Which is fine with me. I'm just saying, I mean, if you didn't want to do affirmative action because it's race-based, wouldn't that be another argument for what you're saying?
Absolutely. And there was one slide where I was displaying what would happen if you use socioeconomic preferences. And one of the points of that slide was that you could achieve substantial amounts of racial diversity precisely because Black and Hispanic students are disproportionately disadvantaged. But the great civil rights leader Bayard Rustin, who supported affirmative action based on class rather than race, said that the importance of this is you can achieve more racial diversity, but you do it in a way that every group, every ethnic group, has a subset of folks who can benefit. So there are low-income whites who will benefit, low-income Asians who will benefit, and so that pushes up against the tribalism that we do see as a negative consequence of using explicit racial preferences.
Okay, thank you. If the audience member doesn't have any more comments, I actually had a question for each of the speakers. Okay. Oh, Alex, did you have a hand? Go ahead, Alex. Alex Erler.
Joseph, you can ask your question. If there's enough time, maybe I can go after you.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Okay, so my question is that, well, so for Peter, I was wondering if you can tell me a little bit about do you think the admission system at Duke University is transparent? And, do you think that families need these formal admissions Duke counselors to tell us what's really going on? Okay, so that's my question for Peter. My question for Richard Kahlenberg was, in terms of socioeconomics, I remember like UC did a study and they found out if you focus on socioeconomics, it actually increases the number of Asian American students, but a slight decrease in African American students. And I think your data shows the same, that Hispanics may go up, but African Americans may go down. So I think so there's mixed effects to focusing on socioeconomics. And so I think race proponents say like it's not enough. But my larger question to you, Richard, is that your vision for like a non-racial, like a non-affirmative action, like vision, to improve like college admissions, to improve America. Is this something that generates a lot of support? I see that I can see it, getting support from like more classical liberals and Heterodox Academy, but how about the more like identity politics folks? Do they also rally around this like non-racial vision of yours? Okay. Or do you see the split between like the Model 1 and Model 2? Okay. And then my question for Rick Sander is, this is more of a Heterodox Academy question. Actually, so at last year's APSA, I talked to one of your colleagues, Jim Volokh, right? Professor Volokh. And he's moving from UCLA to the Stanford Hoover Institute, right? And then, I think he was tired of being such a minority on campus. Okay. And then I was wondering if you can tell me about what is it like to be like a political or viewpoint minority on campus? And if so, like, why do you stay at UCLA? Why don't you move up to the Hoover Institute too? What are the benefits of maintaining this kind of dissenting voice in UCLA? And so those are my three. And also, what are your suggestions for others who may wish to, who are kind of dissenting voices, but still wish to stay in their institution? Okay, so that's for all three of you. Okay, starting with Peter.
Well, mine's an easy answer. No, it's not transparent at all. So yeah, and Duke hasn't actually moved to even put back in the test scores yet. So, and I do think that systems that are not transparent, I'd actually love to see us move more to those systems where you take one test and apply everywhere almost automatically. It's a huge advantage for the rich to have the system that we currently have. When my son was applying to college and he was done with his last essay, we were celebrating and we supported him throughout the whole thing. In a different environment, you might not have that. So yeah, it's definitely not transparent, and those consultants earn their money.
Right, it's a lot of money. Okay, Rick.
Yeah, you had two questions for me. First was, the Black representation can go down under some of the
Right.
socioeconomic affirmative action models, and that is true under our modeling. But I would emphasize that we didn't have all the data that Harvard, in fact, does have to make its admissions decisions. And the last slide I showed was about wealth. So because of slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, redlining, the Black-white wealth gap is gargantuan because wealth captures intergenerational transfers. And so it captures the legacy of discrimination in America better than income. And we did not have in our modeling access to wealth data. So the idea that Black representation will go from 14% to 10% underestimates the potential of socioeconomic affirmative action to provide access for Black students. The other thing to note is, that the 14% is a percentage that resonates with people because Black people represent 14% of the US population. But if we go down that road, where we want every group, it's somehow unjust if it's not exactly proportional, we get into a lot of trouble. I don't need to mention that to this group, to the Asian Americans, Jewish Americans. There are a bunch of groups in the United States who will be artificially capped if the assumption is that anything off of proportional representation is somehow problematic. And that's part of why I push back on the idea that that Harvard, the argument that Harvard made that it had to be 14% Black, anything else was unacceptable. The second question was, let's see. Oh, how do my friends who are into identity politics react to the socioeconomic approach? Well, they hate it. They want racial preferences as a public affirmation of the idea that race is the leading source of disadvantage in America. I think empirically they're wrong about that. I think there are all sorts of downsides to racial preferences too. So this doesn't make them happy. The only thing I will say is that if universities are going to follow the law, then the socioeconomic approach is really the main game that's left for them. And so to the extent that Students for Fair Admissions is actually enforced and universities don't cheat, then we will see identitarian leftists support affirmative action based on socioeconomic status as the next best thing in their view.
Okay, thank you. And then
so-
Professor Alexander.
Just tying on that last point, I would say, Rick, that the alternative to SES now is to use the essays. And unfortunately, if you use the essays, what you're encouraging people to do is portray themselves as victims, and it ties into the whole ideology that we're actually trying to work against. So that's a scary possibility, probably a probability. Anyway, my question was about political isolation on campus, and I want to say two things. One is an anecdote that I know Peter in particular is going to love. I heard this secondhand, so I won't name any names, but about 3 weeks ago there was a meeting at a UC campus by a committee that was wondering whether political tests have become part of the landscape of university administration. And a former UC chancellor actually said, well, not generally, but let me give you an example where there's a political test. He said, if I was a prosecutor and somebody was on trial for murder, I would use as a test, I might try to exclude jurors who said they were absolutely opposed to the death penalty under all circumstances. And he said, so here at UC, we do something analogous, which is if someone says that they support Prop 209, then we exclude them from anything having to do with admissions. So to be eligible to be involved in admissions at UC, you have to be committed to breaking the California Constitution. So yeah, with Eugene departing UCLA Law School, we're down to either 1 or 0 Republicans. I'm not sure if one of my colleagues is a Republican. So there's a huge problem of ideological diversity on campuses. For me, there are lots of things I love about UCLA that offset it. And, in many ways, I've been persecuted some at UCLA, but I've also been treated fairly in many other realms. And I've been able to do my research and found a lot of positive things about the environment. But a key thing that's happened in the last year that I'm very happy about is that we formed a campus heterodox community. We got together the members of Heterodox Academy who were at UCLA, and we started talking to each other. And there were initially 3 of us, and now there are 50 of us.
Wow.
And yeah, and it's a wonderful community. I mean, it's They're a lot of my favorite people at UCLA are part of this. And talking to each other, we realize that we're not alone and we have a lot in common. And as a collective force, we're already having a significant impact, I think, on some campus issues. To give you one example, 3 months after we had a controversial talk that folks tried to cancel unsuccessfully, UCLA announced a new initiative called Dialogues Across Difference.
Mhm.
It sounded like they were trying to steal our thunder. And to the extent they can, they're welcome to. So I think that's the solution.
That's great. I think I'm glad you didn't run away to the Hoover Institute, Rick. So stay at UCLA. Thank you. Okay, Alex, you can have the final question or comment.
Thanks. So, yeah, I was thinking, given also that some of the speakers have expertise in law, which is not my case, I'm trained in philosophy, but I was wondering, the case for race-based admissions is usually framed by appeal to considerations of social justice or racial justice. And I think typically its proponents think, well, this is really a moral obligation that we have, that fairness requires all academic institutions to operate in this way. But I was wondering whether someone who defended race-based admissions could offer a more moderate argument and perhaps appeal to institutional autonomy, considerations of institutional autonomy, to argue for not the requirement necessarily of the practice, but more of its permissibility. And an analogy might be faith-based colleges, right? The argument would say that faith-based colleges, it is recognized, presumably in the current legal landscape in the United States, that these colleges can take steps to ensure a certain kind of composition of their student body, namely predominantly or entirely Christian, for example. And I'm wondering if someone could argue that, well, if you prohibit race-based admissions, you are unfairly forbidding one particular type of such ethical commitment. So maybe the progressive or woke, worldview or ethics, when certain kinds of religious viewpoints are respected, institutional autonomy is respected, and these institutions can enact them in their practices. So could someone allege there is a double standard here? Do you think there is any merit to this line of thought? I'm curious to hear your opinions. Thanks.
Let me give one quick legal response, which is that starting with Bakke, that was the first Supreme Court decision dealing with racial preferences, and going through Fisher, really, which was the next to last one. Supreme Court repeatedly said, racial distinctions are repugnant in modern American society, but we recognize a sphere of autonomy for universities. So the whole idea of university autonomy was an important part of explaining why they were carving out an exception from civil rights laws in the United States. I think part of what undermined that autonomy argument was the lack of transparency and the duplicity, frankly, in the way that universities administered these programs. And it was like, well, if you're not even going to be honest with them, with people, if you're not even going to be honest with students about the possible harmful effects of being admitted with a large preference, if you've just got this whole shroud of secrecy around the whole thing, and when you provide information, it's misleading information, then you're not entitled to the same kind of autonomy that we thought you were. So I think that's one dynamic that has played out recently.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I agree with everything Rick said. The autonomy argument kind of proves too much anyway, because at the end of the day, we crossed that bridge in 1964 when we said that institutions cannot discriminate against Black people, that it was illegal if they were going to receive federal funds. That is what the law provides. So if an institution wants to, it's so important to them that they be able to discriminate or use racial preferences. They have that option if they're if they receive no federal funding. But no, very few institutions want to take that path. And so the idea that taxpayers are either directly subsidizing racial preferences at public institutions or indirectly subsidizing it through all sorts of mechanisms at private institutions, at the end of the day, was not a winning argument, even though it was in Bakke and others a consideration, something they weighed in the calculus.
Thanks. Can I just quickly mention in reply? I think the proponents of race-based admissions would say, of course, it should not be possible or permissible or legal to discriminate against Black people, but say having a policy that tries to somehow match the racial composition of an academic institution with the racial composition of the United States today is not discriminating, as opposed to keeping Jews or Blacks outside of universities, which is clearly discrimination. I suppose that's the kind of argument they would give.
Yes, and that's and I think there's something important to that. That it's an argument that's now been rejected, though. That eliminating discrimination means eliminating all of it. That was the Supreme Court's.
And it had been rejected decades ago in other spheres, like public housing authorities that try to have a racial quota to maintain integration in different housing complexes to reflect the general population. That was ruled illegal back in 1988.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
Just to build on Alex's point, I think it is an interesting point about the use of like the law, to change, to institutional change, that you're using kind of like outside, like legal authority, such as the Supreme Court, to change your institution, say like UCLA. And so I think it's important to that institutional change requires not just that requires both like internal and external forces. And so I think if you're a classical liberal, instead of just suing UCLA, you also want to try to build like change like hearts and minds within UCLA. It's like I think like Max Weber said, like politics is a slow boring of the boards, right? And so I think one Supreme Court decision is not going to change UCLA. It's going to take a lot of work and a lot of conversation. And so I'm very glad that Rick has not run away to the Hoover Institute yet. So he's doing the hard work. Okay. If there's nothing else, I'd like to thank everybody for participating and speaking. And then I'll let you know when the YouTube video comes up. Okay. So can I like to give everybody a round of applause. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, it's an hour and a half, so we're done. Thank you very much. Okay, right. I'm gonna leave. I have to teach class, but Rick, Art, you guys can stay and talk to whoever you want, or not. I think everyone left. Okay. Hey, Art, good to see you. Okay. 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 Good luck. Bye bye. Okay. 어떻게 나가지? I think everyone's okay. Hit the left button. Okay. James, I'm gonna leave, okay?